So, welcome to Tackling Invasives, and I'm thrilled that Joe DeFuria has agreed to and prepared this program for you tonight. We often get
I
questions
don't remember
about
agreeing.
invasives. He totally said yes. And we get these questions, and it's so nice to get the experience of a landowner that is taking these battles on on his own property. Not only is Joe a certified volunteer naturalist, but he's also one of our superstar volunteers at the Portage Park District. And so we're really grateful for all of the expertise and skills that he brings to his volunteer work with the park. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Joe, and so you can share all this knowledge with our audience here.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, as Jennifer said, I've been volunteering for 2 years with Portage Parks. So it's been a very nice experience. So, well, let's get into it here. As she in front of you says, my never-ending fight to control them. You're never going to get rid of them. The best you could do is a hope to control them, and that's hopefully try to share some insight. And for those joined late, I do have that note on the bottom about the QR codes. That I'm gonna have some QR codes of square boxes with the black and white dots in them. They are links to websites that I'm going to be referring to. So if you have your phone, you could take a snapshot of that QR code, and that will take you to that website. Right, nothing's happening. Obviously, I've never done this before. There we go. Okay, first the boring stuff, the differences between invasive and non-native. So non-native plants are any plants that are living outside their natural range. A lot of the non-native plants are from Europe and Asia that are currently in the United States. An example of a non-native is the dandelion. Some people might argue that that's invasive, but it hasn't been characterized as invasive. Invasive plants, there's a lot of definitions out there, but officially they're non-native plants that do economic, environmental, or harm to human health. And an example of a invasive plant is the thistle that you see in the bottom, or the teasel, I'm sorry, the teasel in the bottom right. So all invasives are typically non-native, but non-natives aren't necessarily invasive. And an interesting fact, about 25% of all the plants in Ohio are non-native. And I find that out firsthand walking down the street, and you see a flower growing alongside the road and you figure out what it is, and invariably it's a non-native flower from Asia or Europe or something like that. It's really amazing how many non-native plants are out there. So why are they invasive? An invasive plant kind of takes over. And so in order to take over, you have to have a fast growth rate, high fruit production, efficient seed dispersal. And another big thing is they lack, we'll talk about later, they lack natural predators and diseases that would control them. So they're not native to this country. They come here, they're pretty much foreign to all the other plants and animals, and the other plants and animals don't know how to deal with them, so they take over. So some non-natives can be invasive in some areas, and again, the teasel on the left grown alongside the roadway, you've probably seen them along some roadways. They especially like disturbed areas where the road has been recently graded, and they really take over, form a monoculture, and nothing else really could grow in there. On the other hand, the ones on the right are from my property from a few years ago, and that plant is no longer there. It's in a field of goldenrod. Goldenrod themselves are pretty dominant. They don't let many other species grow. So even though it's invasive in some areas in the field, in my field, it disappeared. So how this all start for me? Well, in 2006, my wife and I, we purchased 25 acres in Hiram, Ohio, and the people we bought it from, the seller's agent, he told us that there were Phragmites on the property, and I had no idea what he was talking about. He goes, "Yes, it's delineated with pink flags. You'll see them when you're out there." So I thought this was something, very bad. And so I Googled up Phragmites and found out what it was. And I go, that doesn't sound too bad. Uh, and this site this is a picture of it. And this site was an old oil well. So I'm imagining that the oil well or the oil people and the gas people coming back here driving their rigs probably brought the seeds in from other sites. And now this is a low swampy area. And that's where my Phragmite patch is. So after we bought, and this is at the end of our about 2 acre field. Everything else we have is trees, as you could see on the back and the right. So due to all the trees, I joined the Northeast Ohio Forestry Association and also applied for forestry land for tax credit. And with that, you had to take classes and you meet with foresters and other people with similar land. And really start learning from them and learning about invasive species and learning how to control them. I had some people from ODNR come out and just tour the property, had some foresters come out and look at the timber. And I'm always asking, thousands of questions anytime someone comes out, trying to glean some information from them. And as Jennifer said, I am a volunteer naturalist, and this PowerPoint was put together for my certification as a volunteer naturalist. So that's where this came from. I did some tweaks for this presentation. So I'm going to go through the invasives that I have just on my property. And if you have similar property, maybe you have the same invasives. So we'll start off with the patch of Phragmites. As I said before, a lot of them come from Europe or Asia. So this came from Asia or from Europe back in the 1800s. And the initial spread was along railroads and rail lines. And from there, it's making its way inroads, into the woodlots and stuff. And the problem with it, it does form a dense monoculture, really takes over, doesn't let any other plants grow up inside of the patch. And very few animals use it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So how do you know you have Phragmites? Well, it looks similar to ornamental grasses people have growing in their yards. It has that fluffy, feathery top. That's the seed head. And they get pretty tall. They're well over my head. So they're probably 6-7 feet tall. They like wet areas, like to keep their feet wet. So you'll see them along on roadways in the ditches. And at least one good thing, they are shade intolerant. So they won't, my patch is surrounded by woodlands on 2 sides. So they won't go into the woods, but they're creeping and expanding up along the field. They do spread via all those seeds, and also just like the grass in your front yard, they spread with the rhizomes. Pretty difficult to control, and I really haven't done much with them yet. It's kind of a low priority. And as I'm going to discuss, you have to kind of pick your battles with these. If you have a lot of them, do the worst first, so to speak. You could do some systemic herbicides, and I'll talk also more about the treatments later on too. And some of them start by burning, whereas not all those dry shoots in the winter, you could have snow on the ground, you could set your patch on fire. Then when they pop up in the springtime, the green growth, then you could treat them at that time. I do have a little patch of monkey flowers. You can see a picture of one there on the right. So the Phragmites are smothering those. So I did try some Roundup last fall. I might have been too late. I might have been after the first frost. That area down there is in a low-lying area, and it frosts pretty quickly. So you have to see when these start greening up if I did any good by killing some of the stalks in the area where the flowers are. Multiflora Rose, it's my biggest problem. Most of the green you see in that picture is Multiflora Rose. People come out and say, well, they're surprised it's doing so well here. Usually they're shade intolerant. Well, like other invasives, they green up prior to anything else greening up. And so the trees don't have leaves on them yet at this time of the year. And so they get plenty of sunshine and they grow pretty quickly from early April until May when the leaves finally appear on the trees. So it's another thing that I've been tackling bits and pieces. My whole woods isn't covered by any means, but there's quite a bit of it. So how do you know that it's Multiflora Rose and not a Blackberry or something like that? So it's a thorny bush. You can see the thorns up here. They are a little bit of a curve to them. Once they get in you, hard to get them out. 7 to 9 leaflets. They're rounded and serrated, oval if you want to. And once you get to ID them, it's kind of easy to tell them apart from the blackberries and the raspberries. So the native blackberry and raspberries, their thorns are pretty much 90 degrees. They're straight. The leaves are come to a point, and sometimes they have a bluish tint on the canes, typically the raspberries. And the difference between a blackberry and raspberry, the raspberry, it has a concave hole, so to speak, where you pull the fruit off the stem, and the blackberry is flat on the bottom. They could be various colors. Here's a side-by-side, not the best comparison. The Multiflora Rose on the left is still kind of small. See the oval serrated, and the blackberry leaf is pointed. Plant shape, this isn't always the case, but generally speaking, the Multiflora Rose likes to grow from one spot and kind of looks like a vase and spreads out, where the blackberry and raspberry canes are just kind of distributed willy-nilly. Again, not always the case, but it's one thing to look at. See, there's more leaves on the Multiflora Rose same time of year than the blackberry and raspberries, although they're not too far behind. And this picture is a direct result of not wearing your glasses when you go out and take pictures of stuff. So I didn't know that it wasn't in focus until I came back. And so control, when you get a large plant, large Multiflora Rose, they have a pretty good well-defined root system. They're difficult to pull out, even a plant that's only like 1 or 2 feet high. So typically I would use a herbicide, and I use a foliar spray, which is a leaf sprayed on the leaves, tricloper, and also a surfactant. And again, I'll talk more on that later. And when I spray, I like to kind of consolidate the branches, bend them in on themselves to reduce the amount of overspray, to reduce the area that I'm spraying, to not spray other plants that are nearby, because these sprays will kill everything except the grasses that are nearby. So just after a few days, the leaves will start to wilt, and you know that it's doing its job. And within 2 or 3 weeks, they're starting to really dry up. And usually at that time, you know that it's taken effect. I might be doing something wrong, but sometimes some of the more well established plants, they re-sprout the following year. You'll get a little bit of green up coming in there, and typically spray it one more time when they're small, and that will do it. There is a natural, I guess, control out there. It's the rosette disease, and it's caused by a mite, and it also would affect your roses in your garden if you had roses. So it's a virus transmitted by the mite, and the leaves start to look distorted, turn reddish in color. They don't really leaf out fully, and it's obvious when you compare this plant next to a healthy plant. And usually it just affects one plant at a time, at least the ones I've seen. and usually they'll die within a few years, but I don't think there's much hope for this to wipe out all the multiflora roses that are out there. So garlic mustard, I think this is one of the more common ones out there. We have garlic mustard pools in the park. This picture is taken across the street from me along the roadway. And I was happy that I didn't have any on my property at the time, or so I thought at the time I was making this presentation for my naturalist class. And then I looked in the woods and I spied a few plants growing, and I go, oh, let me go in there and pull them. So I walked in there and pulled them. I looked up and, oh, there's a few more, and I pulled those, and I looked up and there's more. And 5 hours later, here's my pile of plants, and they're not that very big of plants, but that's quite a few plants that I found. And I think I did catch it in time. So every year I go out there and there's fewer and fewer of those plants out there. It's like, at least I got them under control. And my neighbor's property is pretty bad. And I just call them up and, mind if I pull invasive plants? And you want to pull what? And I explain it to him. And sure, go ahead, pull whatever you want to pull. So I'll go up in the neighbor's lawn or yard or woods and pull their plants as well, just to kind of get a little bit of a buffer. And so I'm not sure, again, how many of you have large wood lots or versus a city lot, but for the larger woods, you need to patrol your borders and see what's coming in from your neighbor's yard. So garlic mustard, again, native to Europe and Asia, introduced in the 1800s for medicinal purposes, and you can eat it. So if you guys want to do some public service, go out, pick some garlic mustard, and you could prepare it like a salad. Google up some recipes. So it does spread really rapidly. It crowds out the native plants, and even in full shade, unlike the Phragmites and some of the other stuff that needs sun. This one here grows in sun, grows in shade. It's a real bugger. It takes 2 years to mature. So the first year, it's a small plant. The next year, it grows up in the same spot, produces the seeds, and then it dies. So the first year plants, they pretty much stay green all year long. Again, another aspect of an invasive species is staying green through the winter while the native plants are dormant or have lost their leaves. And they do produce a chemical that is known to inhibit the growth of other plants. So that's another way that they take over. And garlic mustard not only impacts the plants, but also it could impact fauna, such as the West Virginia white butterfly. There are fewer and fewer of these. I'm not sure they're a species of concern yet, but they're getting there. And the host plant are toothworts, the host plant for the caterpillars of the West Virginia white. So she'll lay her eggs on the toothwort. And the garlic mustard has a similar chemical that's found in the toothwort. And when the West Virginia white thinks she's laying eggs on the toothwort, she's actually laying them on garlic mustard. And the garlic mustard does not provide the right kind of food for the caterpillars of the West Virginia white. So they'd have little or no chance of survival. When I was out at Eagle Creek Nature Preserve pulling garlic mustard a couple of years ago, we noticed the piles of garlic mustard we had laying on the ground. There was several West Virginia whites landing on the garlic mustard that has already been pulled. So kind of depressing. So as I said, it grows in shade, it grows in clearings or crowded spots. So here's again along the road, this is a pretty dense patch of periwinkle, and you don't get much more crowded than that, and still the garlic mustard is able to grow in that mat of periwinkle. So this is what the 1 year plant looks like, a little bit like a colt's foot. Sprouts in early spring, you can see them out there now popping up along the road. Second year plant, an early in the season, and this is a mature plant probably like in June. The leaves shapes have changed. You have flowers on them. So the best way to get rid of them is hand pulling. That's why we have the garlic mustard pulls. But you do have to dispose, you should dispose of the plants or break the tops off the plants because the seed heads, they will continue to develop if you have a stalk on the plant, even though it's out of the ground. So you could pull it and you think you got it, but the seed heads are still developing and it'll still make seeds even though it's out of the ground. So best thing is to pull them and haul them out and put them in a plastic bag and dump them properly. You can also herbicidal spray in the late winter when everything else is dormant. You'll see the small plants out there in the woods. You could hit those at that time. And their seeds, I've read, they could remain viable for up to 7 years in the soil. So you need to just keep going back and checking and checking and checking. Again, hoping to control it, not eliminate it. Another one that I had a lot of when I first moved in was the bush honeysuckle, the non-native. There is a native variety. It's not really as bushy. Again, another plant from Asia. People thought they were pretty with the flowers that they produce, so they brought them over here. Again, same thing. Grows in dense stands, crowds out native plants. And another thing with a lot of these invasive plants, again, the animals did not evolve with these plants. So the berries they produce, although the birds like them, it's like eating a sugar pill. There is just very little nutrition in these berries, these invasive plants. I've also read that it causes like cardinals not to be as red as they typically should be on a better diet. So this is an early spring, but typically when you go out, these are one of the very first bushes that are opening up in the fall or in the spring, and they're easy to identify at that time. They have opposite leaves, meaning the leaves are right across from one another. They do produce some nice flowers, so you'll see people, once they sprout up in someone's yard, they go, oh, these are nice, and they'll just keep them there, and they'll get bigger and bigger and produce more and more berries. And here's another out of focus one. These are pretty easy to pull, even the bigger plants, not real big, but 2-3 foot high, pretty easy to pull. And plants in general in the woods where the ground isn't compacted comes out easier than ones that might be in your yard or a farm field that's more compacted, the soil is more denser. But still, you can give them a pull and they'll come out. If they don't, I have a pitchfork. I kind of just loosen around them and give them a yank, and they'll come out. There are some bigger, much bigger bushes around, especially on my neighbor's property, and you can't pull those. So then you would have to cut them off and treat them with the herbicide. And again, I'll talk more about that later. And one thing that I like to do, I never read it anywhere or heard anybody say it, but hang them high and let them dry. A lot of these plants reroot so easily when they're dropped on the ground that if you drop them and it rains the next day and they're rerouted and away they go again. So I stick them in a tree, a bush, whatever is handy around, and hopefully you can see the dead branches and the root ball there, and that way you know it's dead. Burning bush, not technically invasive yet, but it might be shortly. Again, another one from the Far East, brought in as an ornamental. There was just loads of plants brought in the late 1800s on purpose, just because the people liked the way they looked overseas. So these are being evaluated by the Ohio Invasive Plant Council, and it's probably likely that they'll probably get classified as invasive. They are banned in other parts of the country. There were several nice ones on our property when we moved in. we thought it was great because we paid good money for these when we lived in Stowe in the city, and we come out here, oh, they're grown for free. Well, found out more about them and took them all out now. So they still sell them at the nurseries. Unfortunately, went back later, and there's only one of these left. When they're out in the woods, they typically don't look like the bushy specimens that you see a lot of sun, that get a lot of sun. They have these wing pieces on the branches, an easy way to identify them. And some people say that deer won't eat them, but they like this one. So I cut this one off. I couldn't pull it out. I cut it and sprayed it to kill it. And the next year had all these little ones pop up. So I'm wondering if they had seeds released right before I cut it. Again, they're not that well developed in the shade in the woods, but they do. So, and they do more damage when they're out in the sun in the fields. Again, another one that's pretty easy to pull unless it's entangled in the stumps of other nearby trees. The Barberry, I'll try to move along quickly here. These are those prickly shrubs that people still plant in their front yards. Pretty easy to identify. And one of the easiest ways, of course, after you pull it, then it'll be too late, but bright yellow root system. You scratch away the bark on the roots, and it's really a bright yellow. You know, and one thing about these plants is they are known as a host plant to the black-legged tick, which is a carrier of Lyme disease. So another good reason to get rid of these plants if they're around. Again, they look kind of spindly out in the woods. And you do want to use gloves when you're trying to pull a Barberry. Privet, there's lots of different kinds of privets out there. They're very difficult to tell apart. And for the most part, none of them they're all non-native. So I say when in doubt, pull it out. Very common plant, at least along my street here. You get the dark blueberries in the fall and winter, and they're still on there. As of this morning, I walked by some. It's kind of a spiny plant. You got these 90-degree, I guess they're branches, but it's kind of a spiny, nubby plant. And in the woods, again, in the shade, it doesn't grow that thick. One of these things, these really are common for when a branch falls on the privet plant and pins it back down to the ground. This was the old branch. It becomes the roots and it sends up a new shoot. Very common occurrence with these privet patches. I think they're probably pretty old patches because, you know, they're growing so slow under the canopy, but easy to pull in this stage, even though they have all those roots. But the bigger ones, I mean, for scale, here's my pitchfork, the bigger ones do need to be dug out in some manner or, again, sprayed with the herbicide. Autumn olive, a plant brought here for erosion control. You'll see them along the interstate highways. One clue is kind of a silvery underside of the leaf at times, certain times of the year that when the wind blows, you'll see it. They do like the sunny locations, and they could pretty much grow in anything. These are really tough to pull out. They got quite the root system, at least the ones that I had here. And I would dig and try to get these things out and end up just cutting them off and spraying them. And you got to keep an eye on it. You leave somewhat of the roots in the ground, and they will re-sprout. Okay, so those are the main invasives that I had or have on my property here. So the things I use to treat them with, herbicides and a surfactant, and we'll talk more about those. Big loppers to cut them, a respirator for applying the chemicals, some goggles, gloves, and little sprayer there. You could buy at any convenient or home center. As I said, again, prioritize locations. Do the worst first. I first attacked the fields, the sunny field I have on my property. It was full of autumn olive and pretty much everything, and the honeysuckle and also Multiflora Rose. But right now it's pretty much clear. Got to go after the big plants that are producing the berries that are going to be able to spread around to other areas. And sometimes it could be overwhelming, again, depending on the size of your property. I like to kind of take the approach where I want to see some progress. So I just might do just a small section of, up to the creek or near the path or around the path, around the driveway, kind of divide and conquer, just do bits and pieces at a time. So it's just not so overwhelming where you just throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, I can't do this. So I really like pooling. I mean, it's the quickest, no chemicals out there. You're not going to injure any surrounding plants, but there are times when you get those bigger plants, yeah, you just can't pool them. So the herbicides that I use are listed here. And again, use them at the recommended rate. More is not better. You don't want to put so much chemical in there that you're going to burn the leaves and pretty much don't get the absorption into the plant where you're just killing the leaves fall off and you think you killed it, but you didn't. Follow the directions, as they say. Tricloper is the principal one that I use. It's the common ingredient in weed be gone and brush be gone and the stuff that you spray on dandelions. So it will kill broadleaf plants and woody plants, but it will not kill grasses. So that's why you could use it on your lawn. Spray a dandelion, you won't kill the grass. And I certainly have noticed that where I'd spray maybe a little bit too much on the Multiflora Rose and I kill all the goldenrod around it, but all the grass is still there. And it doesn't last very long. So it seems like it's semi-environmentally friendly. It doesn't stay, it breaks down rather quickly. Glyphosate is better known, an active ingredient in Roundup. Roundup pretty much kills, non-selective, kills everything. It's typically used for broadleaf plants, but if you put a high enough concentration, you could kill some brushy and woody plants. And we probably read the stories or the news articles on the Roundup litigations. Does it cause cancer? They were awarded billions and billions of dollars because of the jury found them as be the logical cause of causing cancer in some people. But I guess the jury's still out. I mean, EPA just made a ruling saying that it's not a carcinogen. So better safe than sorry. Wear your protection when you're using the Roundup. In the surfactant, well, the first two, and you could buy pretty much at home centers. I bought my tricloper on Amazon, bought a gallon jug of the concentrate. It'll last you a long, long time. You buy a gallon of the concentrate, you're only using maybe two to four tablespoons per gallon of water. So the surfactant, it reduces the surface tension between when you spray the chemical on the leaf. So sometimes you might notice if you ever spray water on something, it balls up in little tiny balls not penetrating in. Well, that's the surface tension keeping the chemicals out or keeping the water from absorbing into whatever surface. So by using this, it helps it absorb the chemical into the leaf. And you just maybe a teaspoon of this per gallon. So if you buy a gallon of this at Tractor Supply or whatever, it'll last you pretty much forever. So common sense type stuff. You spray when the winds are calm. You don't want it blowing all over the place when no rain is expected in 24 hours or so. Typically, I like to spray the leaves you can spray them any time of year, but if you spray them in the early spring before the native plants come out, or in the fall when the native plants are dormant, you have less chance of killing the native plants. For the bigger plants or the trees, there's also a basal bark treatment, and typically you use a tricloper. You're just treating the lower 1 or 2 feet of the stump. Most people recommend using like an oil-based diesel fuel or kerosene. I'm not too keen on that. And I've had success just using water and a surfactant. They say you could spray pretty much any time of year, but I like to avoid the spring flush. The spring flush is kind of coming up here shortly, where plants are growing rapidly, where the plants are really taking in a lot of water and taking them up to bringing up to the leaves. So in order for this to work, you really want the chemical to go down into the root system. So the fall is kind of a really a great time, because in the fall, the plants are taking stuff down into the roots, preparing for winter. And if you spray it then the chemical's going into the roots versus up in the tree and being mixed with all that water. And I like to disturb the bark, get some better absorption, or I cut it with whatever you want, a hatchet, a machete, a sickle, whatever, split it a little bit to get the chemical to get inside the plant stem better. And I think this is the first QR code. If you have your phones ready, you want to scan, that's a Penn State University basal bark treatment spreadsheet. And if you're not ready in time, I think Jennifer said, this presentation will be posted later and you could scan it at that time. I think I'm running out of time here. So just some miscellaneous stuff. I discussed before about a lot of this stuff will spread or reroot when fallen branches knock it to the ground. And also, I also mentioned that they're typically the first to have leaves in the spring, and the last to lose them in the fall. So that gives them several more weeks of growing season versus the native plants. And it's also a great way to ID these plants too. If this spring wasn't so early, you could probably go out there now and see a lot of them, but it's already kind of past its peak where the native plants are now coming out too. And when you get them in the woodlot, especially in crowded areas, their roots intertwine with other roots and makes pulling and digging difficult. So then you might have to resort to spraying at that time. Some of the pros and cons. One reason I really haven't concentrated too much on my Phragmites patch is every year we get a small flock of red-winged blackbirds back there. So they do provide cover, some of these invasives, for our native animals. Multiflora Rose, you'll find cardinal, catbird nests, towhee nests in them. And also the deer love to nibble on them, and also bed down in thick patches. So if you don't have the native plants out there, and it kind of depends on what your goals are, you could leave a few of them out there. Just keep an eye on them. But also at the same time, you should be trying to create some patches of native plants. But generally speaking, the cons outweigh the pros, because whenever you leave them out there, they're producing seeds, and they're just spreading them to other parts of your property or other parts of your neighbor's property. So what could you do? You could volunteer to rid the parks of these invasive species. I know the ODNR's natural area and preserves also look for volunteers to pull plants in the preserves, and it's a great way to get off the trails in the preserves and see parts of the preserves that few other people see. Spread the word. Tell your friends and families and neighbors what invasive species are, what the harm they could do. And for you, the people that live in the city lots, you might say, well, they're not spreading on my lot and I have them under control, but the birds spread the seeds, and continuously picking up these small plants that are continuously resprouting from the seeds here and there. And again, act quickly, nip it in the bud, as Barney would say. It really is a helpful way of doing it. On the right here, just real quick, we bought this beautyberry plant because again, this is before I really knew what the heck I was doing. And it's a non-native plant, but the guy we bought it from said, oh, the birds love these berries. So I like the birds. So I bought the plant. It had the berries. The birds never ate the berries. And I ended up pulling 13 of these plants off this hillside, which is a cut. It's just a crappiest soil. And they just were spreading like crazy. And even this was like 3 years ago. And this year I found another one that was still popping up. So it's not an invasive plant, but you could fool me, I guess. So you just got to be careful what you buy. And we're going to talk more about that. So there are 38 species out there that Ohio law prohibits. And I just want to, a lot of these that we talked about, the tree of heaven, which is one of the main host plants for the spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive insect that's making its way into Ohio. And you got the Bradford pear that's starting in a couple of years. It's going to be considered invasive and no longer be able to be sold. Those are the so-called beautiful conical shaped trees you see blooming right now in the field. There's quite a few of them out there. Dame's Rocket is the plant that is a flower, is variably colored flower that in the late spring grows along the road. Some people think they're phloxes, but phloxes don't come out till later in the summer. These have four petals versus the 5 petals of the phloxes, but that's I was surprised to see that that's actually a invasive plant. And the honeysuckles are listed, and the burning bush again is under consideration, and the privets are under consideration for listing. The Invasive Plant Council, they have a ranking. So which the worst invasive plants, and this is just the first sheet. Purple loosestrife, which is a wetland flower that you'll see growing in roadside ditches, is I guess the worst of the worst. Phragmites is number 5, and some honeysuckle, garlic mustard, and so on and so forth. And I'll have a link to the Ohio Invasive Plant Council coming up. So, why are native plants important? What's the big deal? As I was alluding to, they just don't have the species here in the United States to utilize them since they came in from other countries. And this is out of the book of Bringing Nature Home. Doug Tallamy, he writes several books like this, kind of a depressing book, and probably kind of cherry picked the worst of the worst here, but you can see on the chart that some of these plants been here over 100 years, and in the native country they might support hundreds of species, but in this country they only support less than 10. So they take over and nothing utilizes them. And on the other end of the spectrum, again, probably the best of the best are native plants. Several hundred species use oak and willow and cherry and plum, birches, less than 10 for the invasive plants. Again, that's also from Doug's book. So how do I buy native plants? Where do I get native plants, and how do I go about this? The best thing to do is kind of have a game plan before you shop. If you go to the nursery and start looking there, it's kind of overwhelming. And my story is that a couple years ago, we went to a nursery and my wife picked out a plant and she goes, "Oh, this is nice. Isn't this pretty? Want to get this?" And I pulled out my smartphone and I go, no, you can't get that one. That's not a native plant. I go, okay, you picked out another one. Oh, I really like this one. I go, no, can't get that one. So she goes, well, you're not coming with me anymore to this store. And the couple next to us, they got a chuckle out of that. But so if you could have a plan of what plants you're looking for, and they're getting to be more and more nurseries that are kind of going towards the native plants. If you go to Lowe's and Home Depot, you might not have much luck. I mean, you'll find some cone flowers. I know everybody has cone flowers, and they're just a great plant to have. I'm going to go real quick, but these are some great links as to picking some of these native plants. So the first one is the Audubon website, and you put in your zip code, and it'll tell you what plants are native to your areas and what kind of birds they attract. So we'll use Newton Falls, all fours, and should have done this before. So it gives you the list of the plants, what kind of birds they attract, a little bit about the plant, and just give you, there's dozens of plants to pick from. The next one is, I think this one's from Missouri, but they're pretty close to Ohio. I mean, at least you're not buying Asian or European plants. And you could do a search based on all these, the color, the seasons you want it to bloom, sun exposure or shade, what type of plant. So that's a pretty cool site. And this is from Native Plants of Ohio, and they'll give you a list. There's 8 pages like this, and it's a list, and it gives you a great description of the plant, the types of growing conditions, color of the flowers, the type of pollinators that it will attract. Very good. So these are the 4 websites that I was looking at before I hit the wrong button, and great resources. Again, these will be posted with the video when we post the video. So what could you do if you happen to like butterflies and moths? I mean, you drive down the road now, then you really don't see much open field habitat like you have at Morgan Park, where you have a nice field with wildflowers coming up. You either see farm fields or you see woods. You just don't see the wildflower fields. So you could plant host plants and nectar plants. So host plants are the food for caterpillars, and the nectar plants are the food for adults. And what is the most iconic host plant that we know of is the milkweed for the monarchs. So this is my milkweed from a couple of years ago. First year that it came up, monarchs found it and pretty much ate the whole thing. And here's one of the adults on a coneflower. And we do have an upcoming webinar coming up a couple more weeks about very similar creating habitat at your home with this kind of stuff. And if you plant it, they will come. These are my photos from around the house. This is a spice bush swallowtail caterpillar. Although I didn't plant any spice bush, I have them growing wild out in the woods. See lots of spice bush swallowtails on, I think that's a lobelia in the butterfly patch. Tiger swallowtail on the coneflower. And in the top right is my nursery for the milkweed that I started from seeds. And the monarchs lay their eggs right in the pot, right next to the house. They didn't care. And the caterpillars are eating the plants right then and there. And the best example is in the 8 years I was here, I've never saw a black swallowtail. So last year I planted some dill, which is the host plant for the caterpillars. And when you know, later that summer, there was probably a half a dozen black swallowtail caterpillars on the dill, and had a black swallowtail around. So pretty much wrapping up, we got lots of information online, just like anything. There's an Ohio Invasive Plant Council. They had some of the earlier slides that I showed with the list and rankings and resources. ODNR has an invasive plants page. And for those, that really are kind of at a loss or not familiar with, what does a honeysuckle look like in this? I mean, your smartphone is, the best thing you could have. There's a lot of different plant identification apps that you could use. I like to use iNaturalist, and you kind of kill two birds with one stone. You could report locations of different things that you see. But I wouldn't even want to recommend all the other ones because there's just so many of them. But they really do a great job. At least they'll get you in the ballpark and figure out what's what. Is ignorance bliss? I truly believe so. I can't walk through the woods now without looking around and looking for honeysuckle bush or multiflora rose, or walking up and down the street. And this is the road that we live on when I walk the dog. And that hedgerow on the right is nothing but privet, barberry, multiflora rose, and honeysuckle. Probably 95% of that for a quarter mile is nothing but those 4 species of plants. And 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought a thing about it. But now you see how much these non-native and invasive plants are out there, and we have a lot of work to do, I think. But so that's pretty much it. Hopefully it didn't go too long. So
you're right on time.
Right.
So we do have some questions in the Q&A box, Joe, if you want to, you can read those and answer them.
Okay. How do I eradicate the tree of heaven? I don't have any experience with that, but assuming that it's a tree, you could do that basal bark treatment where you would mix up a concentration of the tricloper and spray. You could cut it so it doesn't continue to produce seeds, and then treat the bottom foot or two, typically in the fall, but they say any time of year with the systemic herbicide. The systemic herbicide is one that gets absorbed into the plants. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, Joe, I actually just put in the chat box. There's a link for Ohio State Extension has a fact sheet on Alatus or Tree of Heaven, so you can go there and they talk about control.
And I would like to know what plants you do have in your yard once you get the invasives out. They're good plants to put in their place. Personally, we try in the woods. I don't really replace them with anything. Just let the native. There are some viburnums out there and spice bush, but my wood's kind of overpacked at this time. I don't have much ground cover. But in the field, I get the goldenrod and the asters, and some gray dogwood and silky dogwood. So there's, again, it all depends on your growing conditions, your soil, how much sunlight you get. In the yard proper, unfortunately, I have grass, but do have some patches of flowers that, again, looking for the native flowers and what your goals are. If you want to attract butterflies, pick out the flowers that are the host plants for those butterflies. Kind of hard to go wrong with the cone flowers. Seems like everything likes cone flowers. And there are also, I don't know if Jennifer, you have any links to, and you might talk more about that on your presentation in a couple of weeks, so I don't want to steal her thunder, but there are a lot of resources out there saying substitute this for that, and Jennifer would have some more information on that.
Yeah, I'll look up here the I'm sorry, I just saw a question come in. I will look up the LEAP, put the LEAP website in there. They have a really nice plant this instead of that. But if you're interested in those topics of, what to replace and how to, once you've removed these plants that Joe talked about tonight, then I'll be covering how you can replace it with things that are going to be ecologically valuable.
Okay, this is more of a comment, I guess, but looks like they've had on the, I don't even know how to, celandine, the lesser celandine, think of the, yeah, yellow ground, almost like a ground cover.
Correct.
And I think I actually
Plant.
found one last year, and I just pulled it out. It was just one small one. But it's great if you could use organic control. In this case, the vinegar and Dawn dish soap. So it'd be interesting, yeah, if we could keep Jennifer posted if it's doing the job. I mean, that's a great thing to do. So yeah, thanks for that.
Okay.
And you want to take the last one, Jennifer? How do we sign up for the?
Oh, great. Yes. If you go to I'll pop that into the chat box here. It's going, if you go to our portageparkdistrict.org website, then you can, right on the front page under things to do.
I think you had to hit the show more. I think it was kind of off the list last time I looked.
True, because they only show a few, or you can go out, click on things to do, and you'll have the list of all of
Okay.
them. So it's Portage. Any other questions while we're working away? Joe, they did say, I had somebody mention that there was the link on the ODNR's invasive link, says page not found. So what we can do is check that link, and if there's a new link that needs to be put in, we can include it in your follow-up email. Whoops.
I should have checked all these, but I thought I did.
Well, Ohio ODNR, for those of you who are familiar with that that website, they had their website went down for quite a while this summer, and so some of those links haven't come back up. So it's possible that that's what it is.
Yeah, I just did this a couple days ago, so
well,
yeah, it didn't work for me either. Well, sorry about that.
So, and I put in the chat box now, portageparkdistrict.org. You can go to things to do, and you can register for any of our upcoming programs, but the Creating Habitat at Home is the one that we were referring to tonight. Okay, any other questions that I see here? Well, Joe, I so appreciate you taking the time to share. And if you have folks that are on tonight, if you've got questions that you think of later, I'm gonna speak for Joe and say that he'd be totally willing to answer those.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night.
So long.